The smell of expensive exhaust and roasted chestnuts hung heavy over the Hyatt's revolving doors when Kira Cole tackled a prince into the frozen slush. 3 sharp cracks of a rifle tore through the humid Seoul night, loud enough to stop the heartbeat of the city. She didn't know the young man she was pinning to the pavement was Lee Tae-jun, the reluctant crown prince of the Lee Syndicate. She just knew he was dying. In the underbelly of this city, you learned that being invisible was your only protection. For 24-year-old Kira, the shadows were her only skin, a thin layer of safety between her and a world that looked through her like glass. 3 years ago, Kira hadn't been a ghost. She had been a top-tier medical student at SNU with a photographic memory and a surgeon's steady hands. She had a bright future, a small library of textbooks, and a younger brother she'd promised to protect. Then came the corporate collapse that wiped out her family's savings, followed by her brother's diagnosis. The medical bills didn't just climb, they suffocated. To pay for his care, she sold her books, then her furniture, and finally her pride. When her brother passed away in a sterile hallway because they couldn't afford the next round of treatment, the light in Kira's world didn't just flicker, it died. The grief was a slow-acting poison, leading to a year of silent halls, lost shifts, and an eviction notice that arrived on a rainy Tuesday. Now, her world consisted of a flattened cardboard box tucked into the damp corner of an alleyway across from the Hyatt. The world is a different color when you're looking at it from the pavement. Up there, under the warm gold lights of the Hyatt, people moved with a purpose. They had reservations. They had destinations. Down here, in the damp shadow of an alleyway, I was just part of the architecture. I was a smudge of gray against the brick, as invisible as the steam rising from the sewer grates. I watched him. Lee Tae-jun. He didn't belong in the cold. He looked like he had been born in a climate-controlled room. He stood by the silver sedan, his hands tucked into the pockets of a coat that probably cost more than my medical degree would have. He looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long day, but the kind that comes from a long life. The air changed first. It didn't get colder, it got heavier. Across the street, a black SUV didn't just slow down. It glided to a halt, its windows dark and unreadable. My heart, which usually beat in a slow, starving rhythm, suddenly kicked against my ribs. I saw the back window roll down just an inch. I saw the dull, matte finish of a barrel. I didn't think about my brother. I didn't think about my debt. I just thought about how bright his white shirt looked against the dark street. I was moving before the first crack echoed. My hip hit the slush first, my weight slamming into his midsection. We went down together, the smell of his expensive soap mixing with the metallic scent of old snow. Then, the world turned into white heat. The first bullet found my shoulder. It didn't feel like a piercing. It felt like a hammer blow. It spun me, pinning me harder against him. I heard him gasp, a small, choked sound of pure confusion. I didn't let go. I couldn't. The second one was worse. It tore through my hip, a jagged, screaming pain that made the frozen ground feel like a bed of coals. My vision flared red. I tried to pull him deeper into the shadow of the car's tire, my fingers clawing at the fine wool of his sleeve. The third one was the silence. It entered my back, right between the shoulder blades, and the world simply stopped. There was no sound, no air, just a cold, sharp click deep in my spine. My legs, which had been tense to crawl, suddenly didn't exist. I felt a strange, wet heat spreading across my sweatshirt, blooming like a dark flower in the moonlight. Tae-jun's face was inches from mine. He wasn't looking through me anymore. His eyes were wide, tracing the dirt on my cheeks and the blood beginning to bubble at the corner of my mouth. "Why?" he whispered. It was a small, broken word. I wanted to tell him I didn't know. But as the dark SUV roared away, leaving us in a ringing silence, I realized something new. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't a ghost. I was heavy. I was real. And I was the only thing keeping him on this side of the light. The darkness didn't leave all at once. It peeled away in layers, replaced by a white so bright it made my head throb. I expected the smell of the alley, damp cardboard and old exhaust, but instead, the air was filtered and sweet, like expensive lilies. I tried to move my legs, but there was nothing there. No sensation. No weight. Just a terrifying, hollow silence where my body used to be. My breath hitched, a jagged sound that seemed too loud for the room. "Do not try to sit up, Miss Cole." The voice was as smooth as silk, and just as cold. I turned my head slowly. A man stood by the window, silhouetted against a view of manicured gardens and high stone walls. He was dressed in a suit that sat perfectly on his frame, his hands clasped behind his back. He moved toward the bed with a controlled, predatory grace. "I am Han," he said. He didn't smile. His eyes were like camera lenses, recording every twitch of my face. "I am in charge of your recovery, and your security." He adjusted a plastic tube near my arm with fingers that were too steady. I noticed a faint scar running across his knuckles, a sharp contrast to his polished appearance. He wasn't a doctor. He was a sentinel. "Where is he?" I managed to whisper. My throat felt like it was full of glass. "Young Master Taejun is safe," Han replied. He picked up a clipboard, his expression unreadable. "He has asked about you. Many times. However, his father is a man who prefers order over sentiment." The heavy double doors at the end of the room swung open. Lee Dong-hyun walked in. He didn't look like the panicked father from the sidewalk. He looked like a man who owned the air he breathed. He stopped at the foot of my bed, his gaze moving from my pale face to the monitors chirping beside me. He looked at me the way an appraiser looks at a damaged antique, wondering if the cost of the repair was worth the value of the piece. "The doctors say you will never walk properly again," the boss said. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated in my chest. The third bullet grazed the vertebrae, a permanent souvenir for a girl with no name. He stepped closer, leaning over the railing of the bed. The pressure in the room shifted. It felt like the walls were closing in, turning the massive suite into a velvet-lined cell. "I have looked into your past, Kira. A medical student with a dead brother and a mountain of debt. It is a very touching story," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Almost too perfect. People in my world do not throw their lives away for strangers unless they are paid to do so." "I wasn't paid," I rasped. "That is what worries me," Dong-hyun said. He straightened his cuffs, his face hardening. "You saved my son, but you've become a problem I haven't solved yet. Until I decide if you are a miracle or a mistake, you do not leave this house. You do not speak to anyone. You are a guest of the Lee family. And in this house, guests only leave when I open the door." The morning light in the mansion didn't crawl. It arrived with a sharp, expensive precision. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my feet. They looked the same as they had in the alley, pale, thin, and scarred, but they felt like they belonged to someone else. I reached down and pressed a finger against my right thigh. Nothing. It was like touching a piece of furniture. I gripped the edge of the mahogany nightstand, my knuckles turning white. I had to know. I forced my weight onto my left side, the hip where the second bullet had torn through. Pain didn't just radiate, it screamed. It was a hot, jagged grinding of bone against bone that made the room tilt. I gasped, my vision blurring into gray spots, and my arm gave way. I braced for the impact of the cold marble floor, but the fall never came. Strong, steady hands caught me by the elbows. The scent of that same expensive soap, clean and sharp, filled my senses. "You shouldn't be out of bed, Kira," Taejun whispered. He didn't pull me back onto the mattress. Instead, he braced his body against mine, acting as a human crutch. I looked up. He wasn't wearing the suit today. In a simple black sweater, he looked younger, but the dark circles under his eyes told a different story. He wouldn't look at my face. His gaze was fixed on my hip, his jaw tight. "I have to move," I rasped, my voice sounding like gravel. "If I don't move, I stay a ghost." "Wait," he said. He moved his hand, sliding it down to support my waist. I felt him flinch when he touched the thick bandages beneath my gown. The doctors said the lead did too much damage. They said the nerves. He trailed off, his fingers trembling slightly against my side. He finally looked at me, and I saw it. It wasn't pity. It was a heavy, suffocating debt. Every time I winced, his entire body tensed as if the bullet were moving through him instead of me. He wasn't just holding me up. He was carrying the weight of the fact that I was broken because he was whole. "My father wants to move you to a facility in the north," he said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent hum. "He says it's for rehabilitation, but Han is already packing your things. It's a place where people go when they need to be forgotten." I leaned into him, the pain in my hip pulsing in time with my heart. "And you? What do you want?" Taejun tightened his grip, pulling me an inch closer. "I've spent my life watching people pay for my name. I'm tired of being the reason for the bill." He reached into his pocket and pressed something small and cold into my palm. It was a silver thumb drive. "There are floor plans in here. Gaps in the security feed that Han doesn't know I found. If you're going to walk, Kira, you need to learn where the cameras don't look." The silver drive sat heavy in my pocket, a secret weight that made me move even slower than the injuries did. As I navigated the long, silent corridors of the estate, I realized the house was breathing differently today. On my first morning, the maids had looked past me as if I were a smudge on the window, just another piece of street trash that had accidentally landed on expensive silk. Now, the atmosphere had curdled into something sharper. I passed a group of gardeners in the hallway, and the conversation died instantly. They didn't look at my face. They looked at my hip, watching the slight, jagged hitch in my step. One of the younger girls made a quick, warding gesture with her hand, a sign for protection. To them, I was the saint, the girl who had survived 3 bullets by some dark miracle. They feared the luck I carried, as if it were a disease they might catch. But in the kitchen, the air was colder. The senior staff watched me with narrowed eyes, their whispers trailing off as I entered. To them, I wasn't a miracle, I was a spy. In their world, nobody gives a body for free. They assumed I was a plant, a high-stakes actress who had played the ultimate game to get inside these walls. I sat at the small staff table, my fingers tracing the grain of the wood. A maid set a tray in front of me, steaming tea and delicate biscuits. She didn't drop it or sneer. She placed it down with a trembling hand, her eyes fixed on the floor. It was a terrifying shift. On the streets, people looked away because they were disgusted. Here, they looked away because they were afraid. Power, I realized, wasn't just about who held the gun. It was about whose name caused the room to go quiet. Han appeared in the doorway, his presence cutting through the tension like a blade. He didn't speak to the staff. He just watched me eat, his gaze lingering on the pocket where the thumb drive was hidden. I kept my hand still, my pulse thudding against the silver metal. "The young master is being sent to the family's mountain retreat this evening," Han said, his voice a smooth, flat line. "A security precaution. You will remain here for further tests." I looked up, meeting his camera lens eyes. For a split second, I saw something flicker there, not fear, but a cold, calculating satisfaction. "Is he going alone?" I asked. "He goes with a full detail," Han replied, a small, tight smile finally touching his lips. "Including me." As he turned to leave, I noticed a detail I had missed before. Han wasn't wearing the family's signature gold lapel pin. In its place was a tiny, almost invisible scratch on his suit jacket. It was a new piece of pressure. The man in charge of the prince's life had stopped wearing the prince's colors. I looked back at the tea, the steam rising in the quiet room. Taejun was leaving, and the man who hated him was the one holding the door. The mansion felt hollow after the sun went down. Han's warning about the mountain retreat hung in the air, a countdown I couldn't stop. I found Taejun in a small, glass-walled sunroom at the back of the estate. He wasn't packing. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by rolls of thick, cream-colored paper and charcoal sticks that looked like charred bone. He didn't look up when the uneven rhythm of my footsteps approached. I leaned against the doorframe, my hip throbbing in a dull, steady beat. On the floor in front of him was a sketch, not of a person, but of a sprawling, intricate bridge that seemed to disappear into a fog. "I used to sneak out to the art supply store near SNU," he said, his voice so quiet it barely disturbed the dust motes in the air. "I thought if I could just draw something beautiful enough, the other world wouldn't touch me." He picked up a piece of charcoal and snapped it in half. The sound was like a tiny bone breaking. "My father found my sketchbook when I was 16, he continued. He held out his hands. I noticed for the first time that his fingers didn't sit quite straight. There were subtle, old lumps near the knuckles. He didn't yell. He just sat me down and explained that hands meant for leading shouldn't be stained with ink. He made sure I couldn't hold a pencil for 3 months. I moved closer, sinking slowly onto a velvet chair. I watched him smudge a shadow onto the paper. He moved with a desperate, frantic grace, as if he were trying to outrun the SUVs waiting in the driveway. "Everyone thinks being a prince means you own the world," he whispered, finally meeting my eyes. "But it just means you're the first one locked in the vault. I don't want the throne, Kira. I don't want the ships or the men or the blood that pays for the lights in this house." He looked at my scarred shoulder, then at the way my leg lay uselessly to the side. The guilt I'd seen before was still there, but it had shifted. It wasn't just about the bullets anymore. It was the realization that we were both casualties of the same man. "He's taking me to the north tonight because he thinks it's a fortress," Taejun said, his jaw tightening. But I saw Han talking to the driver. They weren't using the family's encrypted channel. They were using burner phones. He stood up, wiping the black dust from his hands onto his trousers. He didn't look like a reluctant heir anymore. He looked like someone who had just decided to stop running. "I'm not going to the retreat," he said. "It wasn't a hope. It was a decision. I'm going to find the man Han is working for. And I want you to stay in this room. If the lights in the hallway flicker 3 times, use the servant stairs I showed you on the drive. Don't look back." The silver drive in my pocket felt like a hot coal against my leg. I knew I couldn't stay in the sunroom. If Taejun was right about the burner phones, the house was no longer a fortress. It was a trap. I moved down the service corridor, my breath hitching as my hip gave way. I needed to disappear, just for a moment, to let the grinding pain in my bones subside. I slipped into the linen room and found the wide mouth of the heavy steel laundry chute. On the streets, I had slept in tighter spaces. I eased myself onto the ledge, my legs dangling into the darkness of the shaft, letting the thick, discarded towels cushion my weight. Then, the heavy thud of footsteps stopped just outside the door. "The transport leaves in 20 minutes, a voice said. It was Han, but the silk was gone from his tone. It was replaced by a dry, rhythmic pulse. "Is the perimeter team ready?" "They're in position at the bridge," a second voice replied. I recognized it as the head of transport. "The boss thinks we're taking the highway. He has no idea the GPS has been rerouted." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I stayed frozen, my fingers buried in the fabric of a silk sheet. "Good," Han said. "Taejun will be the first." He was always too soft, too focused on his sketches. I spent 10 years teaching him how to survive this world, and all he wanted to do was draw it. It's a waste of a legacy. There was a brief silence, then the sound of a lighter clicking open. "And the girl?" the driver asked. "The girl was an accident," Han replied. I could almost hear the shrug in his voice. "She made the mistake of becoming a witness. Once the cleaning of the family is finished, she'll be handled. We can't have a miracle walking around telling stories about what really happened at the Hyatt." The betrayal didn't feel like a shock. It felt like a cold realization. Han wasn't just a traitor, he was the architect. He had raised Taejun, mentored him, and watched him grow, only to prepare him for the slaughter. He didn't hate the Lee family. He simply felt he was the only one entitled to what they built. "Make sure the jammer is active," Han added, his footsteps moving away. "I want the boss to realize he's alone long before the car stops." The door clicked shut. I sat in the dark, my heart hammering against the metal wall of the chute. Tae-jun was walking into a massacre led by the only man he had ever trusted to protect him. I reached for the silver drive. I didn't have time to wait for the lights to flicker. I had to get to the security hub before the SUVs left the gravel drive. I had to stop being the shield and start being the one who closed the door. I tumbled from the laundry chute, my hip hitting the floor with a dull thud that sent sparks of fire through my spine. There was no time to wait for the pain to fade. I dragged myself toward the main study, my fingernails digging into the expensive carpet. I found Tae-jun near the heavy oak doors, his face pale in the dim light of the hallway. "We have to get to your father," I whispered, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. "Han isn't just leaving. He's closing the trap." Tae-jun didn't ask how I knew. He saw the way my hands were shaking and reached for the door handle. It didn't budge. He tried his keycard, but the small light on the scanner didn't turn green or red. It stayed dark. "The system is offline," he said, his voice dropping to a hollow murmur. Suddenly, a deep, mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. High above us, heavy steel shutters began to slide over the windows, cutting off the moonlight. One by one, the air vents clicked shut. The mansion wasn't just a house anymore, it was an airtight box. "Security mode," Tae-jun whispered. "Han has triggered a full lockdown. No one gets in, and no one gets out until he decides." We heard the heavy tread of boots on the floor above us, Han's men, moving with the confidence of owners. They weren't searching for an intruder, they were taking their stations. We reached the boss's private office at the end of the wing. Through the glass partition, I saw Lee Dong-hyun. He was standing behind his desk, frantically punching numbers into a desk phone that was clearly dead. He looked up and saw us, his eyes widening with a sudden, sharp realization. He reached for the panic button under his mahogany desk, but nothing happened. He looked at his son, and for the first time, I saw the mask of the great boss slip. He looked small. He looked trapped. "He took the primary codes, father," Tae-jun said through the glass, his voice calm in a way that was more terrifying than a scream. I looked at the silver drive in my hand. "Not all of them," I said. I noticed a small, recessed panel near the floor, a manual override for the server room that only a technician or a ghost would ever notice. It was behind a heavy marble pedestal. "Tae-jun," I said, pointing to the panel. "If Han has the main hub, he thinks he's won. But he doesn't know about the medical wing's backup. He thinks it's just for the heart monitors." I looked at the long, dark corridor behind us. I couldn't run, and I could barely stand. But I knew these shadows better than Han ever would. "Go to your father," I told him, pressing the silver drive into his hand. "Stay in the line of the cameras, so they think you're trapped here. I'm going to the basement." "Kira, you can't even walk," he protested, reaching for me. "I don't need to walk," I replied, looking at the narrow, dark air duct near the ceiling. "I just need to crawl." The air duct was a narrow, galvanized throat of dust and cold air. It was barely wide enough for my shoulders, and as I dragged myself forward, the metal groaned under my weight. Each pull of my arms was a battle. My left hip, shattered by that second bullet, was a dead weight that caught on every rivet and seam. I didn't have the luxury of a scream, so I bit my lip until I tasted salt. I could hear them through the vents. Han's voice was calm, broadcasting over the house speakers like he already owned the foundations. He was reciting the kill codes, a steady countdown that sounded more like a funeral march. He didn't know I was 6 feet above his head, moving through the one part of the mansion he considered too small to be a threat. The heat in my back flared as I reached the vertical drop toward the server room. The third bullet wound, the one that had kissed my spine, felt like a hot needle being driven into my marrow. My grip slipped on the oily ladder rung. For a second, I hung there in the dark, my breath coming in shallow, wet whistles as my lungs struggled to expand. I looked down into the black pit. If I fell, I wouldn't just be a ghost. I would be a memory. I didn't fall. I let my medical training take over, visualizing the anatomy of the house the way I used to study the nervous system. The server hub wasn't just electronics, it was a heart, and I knew how to perform surgery. I dropped into the server room with a dull thud. The room hummed with 1,000 blue lights, a digital forest of secrets. I reached the central terminal and ripped the service panel open. My fingers were shaking, but the muscle memory of the lab returned. I saw the primary relay Han had used to bypass the boss. It was a simple bridge, a temporary fix that he'd used to override the estate's permanent logic. I didn't just type a command. I reached into the nest of fiber optic cables and pulled the blue lead. I stripped the casing with my teeth and spliced it directly into the emergency medical circuit, the one line Han had left open so he could monitor my recovery. As the wires sparked, the blue lights in the room turned a steady, pulsing green. I felt the vibration through the floor as the steel shutters on the floors above began to groan open. I had rewired the heart of the house to my own room's life support frequency. Suddenly, the monitor in front of me flickered. A new feed appeared, a hidden camera in Han's private office. He wasn't looking at the security screens anymore. He was staring at a small, framed photo of Taejun's mother. I watched as he slowly laid it face down on the desk. He wasn't just a traitor. He was a man who had spent a lifetime waiting to bury a memory. I reached for the terminal one last time, locking the office door from the inside. The hunter was now the only thing left in the cage. The silence that followed the lockdown was heavier than the noise. Within an hour, the mansion was filled with men in different suits, federal investigators and private auditors who moved through the halls like cleaners scrubbing away a stain. Han and his team had been removed so quietly, it was as if they had never existed. 3 days later, the grand ballroom of the Lee estate was filled with the blinding flash of cameras and the low hum of the world's press. Lee Dong-hyun stood at the back of the room, his shadow long against the marble. He didn't speak. He simply watched his son take the podium. Taejun didn't look like a Mafia heir. He looked like a man who had finally put down a weight he wasn't meant to carry. He adjusted the microphone, his movements steady. I stood in the wings, leaning heavily on a cane carved from dark, polished wood. My hips still pulsed with a dull ache, and my breath was still short, but I was standing. For decades, the Lee name has been built on secrets, Taejun said, his voice echoing through the silent room. But secrets are a debt that eventually comes due. My father and I have decided that the only way to move forward is to change the hands that hold the pen. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Taejun turned his head and looked directly at me. He didn't smile, but his eyes were clear. I am officially abdicating my position within the Lee Group to pursue my own life, he announced. Effective immediately, the majority share of our global shipping and logistics empire, the core of our family's legitimate holdings, has been transferred to the woman who saved the future of this city. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled, shouting questions that blurred into a roar of noise. Taejun stepped away from the lights and walked toward me. He reached into his pocket and took out a small, charcoal sketch of the bridge we had talked about. He pressed it into my hand. "The board of directors is waiting in the library," he whispered. "They're terrified of you, Kira. They don't know how to handle someone who has already felt the worst the world can do and survived." He leaned in, his forehead briefly touching mine. "I'm going to a small studio in Marseille. Don't let my father build any more cages." I watched him walk toward the service exit, the rat's path I had used to save him. He didn't look back. I turned toward the cameras, the silver drive now replaced by a digital key that controlled a multi-billion-dollar fleet. The girl the world had spent years stepping over was now the only floor they had left to stand on. I didn't need to be a doctor to see that the city was sick. But as I walked toward the library, the rhythmic click of my cane on the marble sounded like a heartbeat. A new one. And this time, I was the one who decided when it stopped.